Hello, everyone. This week's Bitch Better Have My Money lectures will be brought to you from the Golden Pagoda in Kyoto, Japan. This lecture will focus on subsistence patterns and economic anthropology. So, what is economic anthropology? Well, this focuses on subsistence strategies and economic systems. So, how we get our food, our sustenance, how we deal with financial issues like banks and debts, how countries collect taxes, how religious people think about charities, how consumers choose products, how marketing works, how corporations affect societies. These all fall under the category of economic anthropology. So let's talk a little bit about human subsistence patterns, which is the basic subject or unit that economic anthropologists look at. Subsistence patterns are the ways that people process the resources around them so that they have land, shelter, food, and the technologies necessary in order to live functional lives in society. Now, a surprising amount of the human species lives at subsistence level, meaning that they either don't have an income, they live entirely off of the land and trade and barter, or they have no disposable income whatsoever. So the only money that they make is immediately spent on their basic subsistence needs, food, shelter, etc. This isn't quite living paycheck to paycheck. It's kind of a step below that. But when we try to understand people's basic economic units and how they reach their subsistence needs, we have to think about what kind of settlements do they live in. Do they actually live in settled populations, or are they nomadic? If they are settled, what's the size of those settlements, from villages and clans all the way up to megalopolises, mega cities? So we are interested as economic anthropologists in how people choose to settle, what their patterns are, where they dwell, what kind of buildings they build, what kind of habitats they choose to move into and settle, and ultimately how they shape and change those habitats in order to fit their settlement needs. So we also study bartering, trading, and giving. And this has to deal with the way that society distributes goods and how we earn the right to access those goods. Usually that's in the form of labor or payment. And so one of the main focuses when studying subsistence patterns is who does what labor? Who does what trading, and how are they involved in the redistribution of resources? So that might be based on gender or class or age. And we want to understand how this trade is distributed in networks. We also study reciprocity, which is gift giving or exchange of materials freely. So let's talk about foraging and food production. Foragers are those who take their food from the environment. This is sometimes known as hunters and gatherers. On the other side, we have those who produce their food. They have to manipulate their environment. They don't just get their food from nature, but they actually have to change nature and reshape it in order to produce food. Much of the world, I'd say most of it, are food producers in some shape or form. So let's talk a little bit about foraging, which is also known as hunting and gathering. Those terms are interchangeable. And foragers have a territory in which they move around and gather resources. Usually these are seasonal because whichever plants and other resources are available based on season, that's where they're going to move to and live. Hunters and gatherers work about 40 hours a week, sometimes even less than that, and division of labor is not particularly clear cut. This is actually a group of people who have a high quality of life. They're able to maintain small populations, and so nobody has to work very hard or very long in order to meet their basic nutritional needs. The Dobeju Huansi are talked about in your text, and they are an excellent example of hunters and gatherers who still live in sub-Saharan Africa today. Now, we also have pastoralism. Pastoralism is herding animals or being a shepherd. And pastoralists get their economic production from animals. So that can mean that they produce meat. That means that they can produce other resources which come from animals, such as milk or wool or leather, etc. But pastoralists fulfill all of their subsistence needs by raising animals rather than growing crops. We as a species domesticated animals around 10,000 BCE, so about 12,000 years ago. And to be completely honest, we domesticated some animals, and then some animals domesticated us. Dogs most definitely domesticated humans, not the other way around. Pastoralists tend to have to move a lot because they have to feed large amounts of animals. And so, especially in areas that have a lot of seasonal variation, pastoralists also are often nomadic and thus have like a winter ground and a summer ground, or a winter home and a summer home, based on their animals' needs for fields to graze in and things like that. But pastoralists have not fit in very well in the 21st century in particular, and that's because pastoralists tend to need a large amount of land and they like to move freely. So things like highways and state borders are like a huge problem for them. And then there are nomads. Nomads are people who do not have permanent settlements. Rather, they have, in most cases, seasonal settlements, and they move between those seasonal settlements. A lot of pastoralists are example of nomads. You remember earlier in the semester, we talked about the Tuareg people, the indigenous people of North Africa and the Sahara Desert. They are nomads who move throughout the Sahara Desert because no small area has enough resources to sustain them for the entire year. The process of pastoralists moving from one pasture land to another so that they are able to maintain their subsistence is known as transhumance. In contrast to nomadism is sedentism, and sedentism is staying in one location on a permanent basis. This requires territoriality. In other words, you have to have your territory, your place, and you permanently live in it. That requires that concept of territory that you control and that you possess. Sedentism is very common. You are probably sedentary, almost certainly. Sedentism requires surplus, and usually at the beginning it's only a small amount of surplus, but as the population grows and they are able to master more land, often through agriculture, more surplus is produced, and this allows humans to create larger communities and larger settlements. This allows for trade and civilization, because when you have surplus, some people can farm, but other people don't have to farm because you have surplus, and so they're allowed to do things like write laws, make religions, make art, make tools, and do other kinds of labor that isn't growing food. So surplus means, and sedentism means, that you have all of those neat social organizations of civilization, but it also means that you have problems of sanitation and disease, because sedentary lifestyles means everybody lives in the same place, craps in the same place, leaves all their garbage in the same place, and eventually that can breed disease. Whereas nomadism, you're kind of just constantly moving through things, and so you're less likely to contract disease and have sanitation problems. So pastoralists get their sustenance from animals, but most humans are not pastoralists. Now, there are still some humans who practice horticulture, although this is not very common today. Horticulture was kind of an earlier step in our agricultural process. The textbook has a definition of this, and it blows. I'm not even going to repeat it. I'm not going to use it. Don't use it. Use my definition of horticulture. So horticulture is the practice of working with natural processes to raise crops that are already there, or that you put there with very little technological input. So horticulture is basically realizing that there are edible things growing and then just like eating them. Not planting seeds and raising crops. That's agriculture. We're going to get to that in a minute. So horticulture is more like going through the woods and finding mushrooms, or realizing that a whole bunch of corn is growing in this area, and so like moving to that area and living near the corn that's there, but not actually planting it itself. So this is an earlier stage in agriculture, and it's not very common today. Today, we have agriculture, and agriculture is a process in which we manipulate nature around us using technologies so that we can produce food and eat it and survive as a species. And this comes in two different sizes. Simple agriculture, which just means human labor and handheld tools. When I was in Bali, for example, I was able to see the rice plantations, and the rice plantations, which are these tiered steps, you can see it in the image down there, are actually a lot of the rice sowing and a lot of the rice harvesting is done by hand. So that is still simple agriculture. On the other hand, in the United States, we have a lot of intensive or complex agriculture, which uses massive amounts of technology, machinery, irrigation, animal labor, agrochemicals, etc. Now, there are in the United States both simple agriculture farms and intensive agriculture farms. It's not an either or, and it doesn't necessarily depend on the crop that's being grown. Really, it depends more on the size of the farm and the amount of produce that's being produced. But elsewhere in the world, we see all sorts of examples of simple agriculture and examples of intensive agriculture. Whew, that was a long one. Thanks for sticking with this Bitch Better Have My Money lecture, and hopefully you are more comfortable with some of the economics terminology that we will be using this week in our discussions of economic anthropology. Thanks so much for listening.